Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and we are creating space to have conversations where we are reimagining the church for our current moment. And I am really excited for our conversation. Today, I get to introduce you to a friend of mine, Blaine Hogan, and I'll tell you about Blaine in a second when we start the interview. But one of the things I got thinking about was later on in the interview, Blaine shares a bit about a small gathering that he was a part of that we had put together. And I got to thinking that may spark some curiosity for some of you. And so if it does, I want to let you know, while I am not great at regularly putting out a newsletter, when I put together different kinds of gatherings, I am usually pretty good about at least one time putting those out on that newsletter. And so if you hear Blaine talking about that and you're like, how do I get to show up at something like that? Go to mikegoldsworthy.com, subscribe to my newsletter. And when I put together different kinds of gatherings, I usually try to put out something on there at least once when there is space available. So I'd love to have you be able to be a part when we do things like that. But you'll hear about that in a minute. I think I had so much fun. I think you can tell in my conversation with Blaine. And I do think like this is such a helpful conversation for those of us in leadership, those of us who are leading churches, those of us who are having other people look to us to provide some sort of direction. And I think what Blaine, his journey and the way that he has been able to bring us into that offers us such helpful and hopeful direction for what it looks like for us to do our own kind of work. Anyways, I think you're going to love this conversation with Blaine. All right, friends. Well, we are here with Blaine Hogan, and Blaine has a new book out, and it's called Exit the Cave, Embracing a Life of Courage, Creativity, and Radical Imagination. So, Blaine, thanks for hanging out with us today. It's
Hi, Mike. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. Here is your bio from the back of your book, which was different than the bio on your website. But I thought for the crowd that listens to this, I'd use your book bio, which says that you're a writer, film and creative director and actor, former creative director for Willow Creek. You are currently a full-time filmmaker living in Atlanta, Georgia with your wife, Margaret, and your 3 daughters, and have a master's degree in theology and culture from the Seattle School of Psychology, and you have appeared in many stage productions and television shows. You're fancy.
You know, we just said, let's throw it all in. Let's do all of it. Well, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, so I can't help but be all of those random things put together, but they're true. Whether or not they're fancy, Mike, that is up to, the listener here. But I feel pretty lucky that I've gotten to do all of those things.
Yeah, well, here's what I was thinking about you is that some people would be stoked to talk to you or like a little starstruck because of the role that you played in the TV show Prison Break. Some people, would know you for your creative director role at one of the most influential churches in the country and really in the world, and they would be stoked and starstruck. Some people because of like your directing work with people like LeBron James, like that, and would be like, oh, that's whatever. But for me, the thing that makes me starstruck every time I talk to you is because you are the creator of Happy Friday Dance Party.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, go on, please. Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Well, for people who don't know, who weren't in the know at that time, years ago, I don't even know how many years ago this was. Do you?
12 years ago.
12 years ago.
Yes, because I recently unearthed a cache of old videos.
Okay, well, we need to get those on the internet.
Okay. I did post a couple on Instagram. They were taken down because I didn't have the rights to the music. 12 years ago, no one cared what you put on the internet. But yes, go ahead, please.
Okay.
I would like to hear your description, and then
my
I'd be happy to
experience
provide some color commentary.
Yeah, my experience was so you were working at Willow at the time, and I remember, I don't know, somebody in one of my circles like reposted one of these videos that you would do on Fridays where like you would play a song and you would just do this like white guy straight-faced dance to it, and it was wonderful. And I used to tell people like, oh, I watch these with my kids, which was partially true, but I'm mostly like I got excited every Friday. Like, do you remember
There for you.
Homestar Runner? Were you ever into Homestar Runner?
Yes. Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
and that was like maybe one of the like early internet phenomenons for Gen Xers who
Totally.
like of like it got released every week, and like we
I
would.
like to, Mike, 1 second. I'm 42, so I prefer to be referred to as an elder millennial. So
Oh
I know
yeah,
you're a little older than me.
I'm just
So
barely older than you, and I'll take Gen X.
okay, great. Go on. Go on.
So we would like in our office, we would gather around. I think it was every Monday, a new Homestar Runner would get released, and we would all
Yeah,
watch Homestar Runner together.
totally.
That's how I felt for Happy Dance Fridays.
Oh
Was like
man.
every Friday, like I would like go onto the YouTube to watch it, and the one that I remember the most was the song Dynamite,
Yep. That
and
one
like we
incorporated props. It
yes,
had some cards. I think there was a confetti
there
explosion
was. I
at
just
the
rewatched
end.
it this morning.
Oh my God. Where did you even find them?
So our mutual friend Kim Meyer has it on her old blog somehow. Like I was Googling trying to find it and
Like you just
reached,
searched Blaine Hogan Happy Friday Dance Party?
yeah, it was something like that.
What?
And she had two posted on there that somehow survived.
Oh my
And
God.
I was able, and one of them was Dynamite, which was my
Sure.
favorite one.
Okay, well, so a little context.
Yes,
So
give
I had
us.
been, yeah, the origins of Happy Friday Dance Party.
Yep.
First of all, I am the inventor of TikTok dancing. I just, it is, I am the godfather. No one had done it before. No one was doing just silly dances. And I did it 12 years ago. I think it was actually probably Vimeo because I somehow thought Vimeo was
Hmm.
cooler at the time than YouTube. But yes, uh, I had taken a job, kind of begrudgingly as the creative director at Willow Creek Community Church, which you can kind of read about the story of how I got there in the book.
Nice
But I,
plug.
Thanks. Yep. It's called Exit the Cave. Embracing a life of courage, creativity, and radical imagination contains all my deepest, darkest secrets and is available wherever books are sold. Audible book will be releasing shortly as well. The audiobook. I just finished up the recording for that. So I was feeling kind of bored in my job. The routine of daily and weekly creativity, doing it at such a large scale, there's a lot of intensity to it. And we were doing like big stuff that getting people to feel deep things and have a connection with God. And I found myself becoming really serious and kind of bored. So I realized I needed some sort of creative exercise to help kind of get me out of that. And I came up with this experiment. I would call it Happy Friday Dance Party. And every Friday, I would put on about a minute of music. I would record myself dancing. And then whatever I did, I would immediately post it to the internet. So
You didn't pre-plan the dances?
no,
Okay.
nothing. What I did, I planned out the time that I was going to record. And of course, I had to wait until everyone had left. So usually I recorded them like late Thursday nights. I'd be like, hey, babe, I got to stay, got to record Happy
Gotta
Friday
work
Dance
late
Party. Yeah,
on
got to work late.
Thursday.
Got to work late. And then I just did that. And so that was literally 12 years ago. And that became this sort of meme again. So I also invented memes, Mike. Um,
Yeah.
so I mean, it's like Al Gore, internet, Blaine Hogan, TikTok, and dancing white guy memes. So
No,
that's what I did, and I haven't done them in a long time, but I did recently unearth a bunch and started trying to post them on. Actually, posted them on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, but some of them got taken down because you don't hold the rights to Dynamite.
that's so interesting. There's got to be a workaround somehow.
Totally. Yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah. And I think that people will stitch videos, dance videos. So I've
Okay.
been wondering if I don't go back and learn the choreography that
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
could teach myself. The funny thing is, it is very bad dancing, but I was a dance minor. Most people don't know this. It's not in my bio. It's not in my bio, but I was a dance minor, and that is true statement.
I love
So
this
you
so
may
much.
see some. So if you are familiar with dance vocabulary, those who do know Mike will see some of my moves, and they're like, "Oh, okay, I see what he's doing there."
Okay. So to like bring it into a not just reminiscing about something that I could sit and talk to you about forever that most of the people listening
Oh,
could
I thought
care
that's
less
all we
about
were
probably.
doing today.
I I would be glad to just talk about Happy Friday Dance Party for a long time.
Yeah, we want to do something else.
Well, here's kind of what I'm curious about is like, did you, it sounds like in retrospect, like it was an intentional decision in the moment was an intentional decision, or was it almost like intuitive, like I feel trapped in some sort of way and I just kind of got to break out of that? Like, was that a sort of thing for you, or was it like, and you just kind of like stumbled on it like intuitively, or was it really like, I sat down and realized I'm doing this kind of job that's doing this kind of thing to me, and I need something that moves me in a different kind of way to feel like I break out of that. And so I'm gonna, like, which way did it sort of work for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little bit of both,
Okay.
honestly. Certainly, there's some intentionality of it. We find ourselves stuck in various places in our lives, and what I know is, and I think I probably, to be honest, or like go really deep, is realizing now that like my body needed to do some moving. Like the somatic therapy that's sort of now very much in vogue wasn't something that people were talking about 12 years ago. But I look back on it and go, well, that's certainly part of it. Another part was just the silliness and ridiculousness of it, not taking myself so seriously, realizing like I needed to kind of, jostle some things up. And then also the kind of Seth Godin just ship it mentality,
Yes.
where I have my best friend right now, Jared. He has wanted to write for a long time, but he doesn't necessarily want to write a book. And he's like, I don't want to write a newsletter. And so he gave himself the task for the next 6 months. He would write a chapter a month. And for the 30 of us that he chose to send it to, he goes and gets it printed, he staples it, he mails it. So every month he's shipping these little kind of missives, these chapters about his life. And it's just like that, the intentionality of going, that this is not something that's going to be precious. I'm not going to edit it. The purpose of it is both a creative experiment and a personal experiment. And so I think it's like I said, it's probably a little bit of both, but I knew something had to change. I knew I had to shake things up. And so I shook my hips for you, Mike.
For me, um, I love the idea of like, when you are doing something where you're like creating for a living in some sort of way, that you are creating something that is simply the purpose of it is to create
Mm.
and not to make it perfect, not to make it producible, just to simply like create for whoever that is going to connect with, even if it's just sort of for you.
Totally. And I'll be honest, like that's kind of how I feel about the book. I'm
Yes.
not My wife's the real writer in our house. Our first year of marriage, she went out to LA, did a screenwriting program, went back and forth pitching various scripts. She's worked on a couple of books. She's really the editor of the book, to be honest, in a lot of ways. But when I got this contract to write this book, I thought I was going to write a book about the creative process, because that was when I got actually, Mike, do you want to go here right now?
No, this was genuinely my next question. Like
Oh, okay.
here's what I've written down is that I want to I'll read you word for word what I wrote
Great.
down so you can
Okay.
see. Like I want to talk a little bit about the process of the book before we get to the book, because if I remember right, you signed a book contract to write a different book than what you ended up writing.
Perfect. Mike, we're so in sync. I think it's probably because you've been watching some of my dances for so many years. Like
Yeah.
we're dance partners at this point. It's no
You didn't
longer a
know
solo
it.
act.
Yeah. I'm like the
Could you
stalker
do
dance
any of the
partner.
moves, do you think?
Well, the one that I can do is in Dynamite. You say the song goes like "Told you once, told you twice," and you do a little thing with your hand.
Yeah.
Told you once, and then told
The
you
magic
twice,
trick.
like
That's
the
right.
magic trick. So I do that every time that song comes on because of that dance. And anyways, I was re-showing my kids this morning the video, and I was like, "Hey, do you guys remember this? Because I'm talking to him today." And we were watching it, and my daughter goes, "That's the thing that you do." And
Oh
I was
my
like,
God.
"Yeah, I stole it from Blaine."
Gosh, when you realize the influence you've had on people, it's humbling. When you realize the ways in which you've impacted humanity, that other dads out there are doing the one hand to two trick, but only to that song is a gift. So you're
It's a
welcome.
gift. It's a
In
gift.
2018, I got a contract for a book because I was a creative director at a mega church, and that's kind of what you did.
Yep.
Especially because of where I was at Willow, I was surrounded by authors. That sort of circuit of Christian professional, Christian creative, Christian um, pastors, teaching pastors. You just wrote a book. And I genuinely wanted to write a book. I believed in sort of the thoughts and thought process that I'd been going through, especially over the last, the 10 or 15 years leading up to that point. But at any rate, I pitched a book for the creative process. Only one person. I had friends who were getting multiple offers, and there was bidding wars, and I was like, oh, this is going to be amazing. I can't wait to all the offers that will roll in. And everyone passed except one publisher. One publisher, said yes. I'm so grateful that they did. But I was not in any position. It was, yeah. So just full disclosure. It was a humbling experience. So I got this book contract to write a book, what I thought was going to be about the creative process, sort of the tips and tricks of things that I had learned. I'd written a self-published book called Untitled. It's like a little primer on the creative process, kind of Seth Godin. And so I got this contract, and then right around that time, Willow Creek fell apart. Our senior pastor was accused of all kinds of misdeeds, and a lot of things happened, and the church fell apart. 12 different families, the closest friends of ours, moved out of state, all different places. And the church that my wife had grown up at, the church that in many ways had become a safe haven for me in my addiction, a safe haven for me to process and become a better human and a better artist. It was all kind of crumbling. And at that time, as I started to write, I realized that I probably needed to write a different book. That
Hmm.
what I wanted the stories that I wanted to tell weren't necessarily about the creative process. That was certainly a part of it, but the stories that I needed to tell were my own. And so I did what every professional writer does in that scenario, and they ignored their publishers' emails and their agents' emails for months and months at a time. I just didn't respond. I just like ghosted them. And then eventually I had a meeting with my agent, and there was another person on the Zoom call, someone that I hadn't recognized. And I realized very quickly that I had been bamboozled into an intervention. And Alex, who is my agent, introduced me to this very kind woman named Meredith, who said, Meredith is a writing coach. And I wonder if she would be able to help you. And I was like, yes, I do need so much help. And so Meredith and I began this process where she said, forget everything that you pitched, forget the book that you sold, start talking to me about the book that you want to write and the stories that you want to tell. And for about 6 months, she and I wrote 1,000 words a day, and I would send them to her every single day. And she would respond, and she would give me more prompts based on kind of ideas that I had laid out. And before I knew it, I realized the story that I wanted to tell was actually my own.
That's, I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting to me about that is is So I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, and I think my natural proclivity would be like, this is the book that I agreed to do. I'm just
Mm.
going to like force myself to put that thing out. And one of the things that I loved is the idea of like there was a thing that you agreed to do, and you realize that underneath that there was something that was better that needed to come out.
Yes, that and the thing that I had um created the pitch in that container of sort of Christian creative megachurch. I had left a year
Yeah.
prior, so 2017 is when I officially left my role. We were still a part of the church in 2018 when it all fell apart. And I think that something that I think a lot about, I write about in the book is grateful for it's the gift of rock bottom, whatever that
Hmm.
is.
Hmm.
Had that thing not fallen apart, Mike, I probably would have just done exactly that. But it had all fallen apart, and it gave me a certain amount of freedom to do something different. Also, because I realized I no longer was a part of that community in that way, where I then needed to think about what conferences am I going to speak at? Where am I going to promote this book? How am I going to sell it? All of those sort of
Practical.
Christian
Yeah.
author speaker things, I was fully released from that world and was pursuing something very much outside of that in terms of commercial filmmaking, that it had freed me up to go, what do I want to, what do I really want to say? And then also what came with that was a lot of fear of like, holy shit, what do I want to say? And who's gonna buy this book?
Yeah.
Who's it for? All of a sudden the audience that I thought that I knew for sure that I was going to be going after was all thrown up in the air. And that has created a lot of fear, but a lot of freedom as well.
Yeah, and it's still a book about producing like creativity, right? But it's like approaching it not from a like here's 5 things to do to get your creative juices going or whatever, but like from the sideways sort of way of like recapturing your story and who you are and the honesty of that journey, like actually unearth something in you to be able to. Is that a fair way of?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the sort of log line that I would say the book is, it's the story of my abuse, my recovery from addiction, and how a new understanding of creativity saved my life. And
Hmm.
so along the way, I realized that the art project that was going to become the greatest in my life was actually my life. And so what I started to do is I began my kind of recovery and healing process that I talk about in the book is using all of the things that I learned to do as an artist to uh, approach my work with radical imagination, to approach it with courage, commitment, to take risks, to do it afraid. All of the things that I had used in service of making art, I then had to use in service of saving my life because I had come to a precipice where it had become kind of life or death for me.
Hmm. So, one of the things that I remember you saying when we first connected that you then like reiterate in the book as well is I remember you saying something to the effect of one of the things you learned from Dan Allender, who's been a mentor to you and is and started the school that you did your master's degree at, and he's
That's right.
phenomenal for folks that don't know him. Where would you point people to? Like, what would be the book or whatever for like people who don't know Dan's work?
Yeah, I would say especially regarding story work, a great primer for Dan is To Be Told.
Hmm.
And then their recent book, which is called, hold on, Mike, um, Redeeming Heartache.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
then I would say Dan's new book, Redeeming
Okay.
Heartache, is probably the best.
And Dan is phenomenal. I've never gotten to meet Dan, but like his work has certainly impacted me from afar.
Mm.
And I remember one of the things that you said that he said to you, or maybe in class, was something to the effect of like thinking about the past, the present, and the future. The one thing that you can change is your past. And like, do you mind talking a little bit about that? Like, this was this like really um, it was this idea that was so significant for me to hear and
Mhm.
really a helpful framework, I thought.
Yeah, and, let me give you I'll give people just a quick context. You kind of positioned my current professional resume and bio with the one that's on the back of my book. Prior to all of the things that we're talking about, I was a professional actor and was working all around country. And yes, I had been on this television show where, let's just be honest, I was a prison bitch for 3 to 4 episodes in Prison Break. So please go to Netflix, watch it. I get a quarter of a cent every time that you watch it. So please go ahead and do that for me and my family and our college fund for our children. But I had come to a place where basically my life was falling apart. The abuse that I had suffered as a kid, the way I attempted to salve those wounds was through acting out sexually, and I had a full blown sex addiction and had come to a place where my life was coming apart. Someone had introduced me to the work of Dan Allender. And as I started reading his work, I realized he also had started a school out in Seattle. And it became clear that that was just the next right thing for me. And so I called my agent, said, I'm going to go to Seattle and take 2 years off to go to this seminary, which I guess it was, and just go do that. And they were like, okay, we don't understand that at all, but if that's what you wanna do, then you need to go do that. And so I ended up in Seattle. I pulled the plug of all the kind of up and to the right career stuff that was happening. Now, just also, I do need to note, this was not kind of like a Kirk Cameron sort of like thing where I just cannot be a part of the industry of Hollywood and making secular art any longer. It really was just my life was falling apart. I needed to do something different. And so I found myself in Seattle and in the class with Dan Allender, and he tells us this statement that's so unbelievably hyperbolic. He says, you can't change your future because it hasn't happened yet. You can't change your present really because we're in the moment of it. The easiest thing to change is your past, which is absolutely ludicrous. In fact, what I believe is like the one thing you cannot change. It's already happened, it's come and gone. And the way he described it was this sort of like space time continuum, back to the future doc sort of moment where he says, we all like, we all think of time very linear, past, present, future. But of course, the way we experience time is somewhat inversed. It isn't past, present, future. It's past, future, present. And he began to describe that whatever's happened to you in the past, you take all of those experiences, the good and oftentimes the bad, which had the most impact, and you template and imagine those things in the past will happen again in the future. And so then, however you are imagining the future is how you live in the present. So he said, of course, we can't change what happened in the past. You can't go back and change the abuse. You can't change the trauma. But what you can do is modify the meaning of it. You can go back into those stories and realize that maybe you have become an unreliable narrator. And through the work of unearthing some of the particularities of your story, through processes of writing and work with therapists and with groups of people to reflect back to you as you tell those stories, you can begin to change the past because you begin to re-narrate it differently. And so then you play that back out in sort of reverse order. All of a sudden, this past that you thought was locked, and this is just what it was, and this is what happened to me, and it's always going to happen again. You realize, oh, maybe I've been misdiagnosing the meaning of that story that I've been holding my entire life. And then all of a sudden, that unlocks your imagination about what can happen in the future. And now, if all of a sudden you have a new and radical imagination for what the future can hold, then you live differently in the present. And it becomes this incredibly beautiful dynamic cycle where you keep going back to stories that you thought were locked, set in stone, and you really do begin to change the past. And I think based on what you were saying earlier, that really is sort of what unlocked that is my new understanding of creativity. Because
Mm.
you as an artist, you try and create things that have never been before. You try and imagine new futures and new worlds, and then you try and figure out how to make them in the present day. And I realized, oh my God, I could do that with my life. And
Yeah.
if that happens, if that can change, what else can change?
It's so good and it's so like freeing and like full of possibilities. The idea of like the flexibility of the past is so like interesting and inspiring to me. And I was thinking a bit about like a lot of the folks that listen to this are folks who are reimagining their faith, or
Hmm.
they are folks who are leading churches that are trying to reimagine the church. And I'm thinking about like how significant that work is as you are working through your own faith journey and the way that you
Yeah.
understand faith, of like that you've inherited stories, you have had experiences, you have been in certain kinds of churches and things like that. And you're just trying to like push forward as opposed to like going back and reimagining that. Do, I mean, do you mind like sharing a little bit about like what might that look like in a like a faith journey process?
Yeah, that's a really great application. And I think that there's probably two things at play. One, you need to break away for a time. You sort of need to be the rebellious child of like, F you, dad. I don't need that anymore. And because what that's the work of differentiating. And in many
Mm,
ways, I did that with my life when I said, oh, I need to take 2 years off from my um, what I thought was going to be the only thing I ever did in my life. I needed to differentiate. That is good and healthy and holy work of leaving home and saying, I feel like there's something else out there. And then at the same time, I think that there is some beauty to returning to the past, to returning to those old stories. I remember an example that I think of from seminary. Actually, we had this professor, Dwight, and, yeah, I remember it was a class on hermeneutics, and so we were kind of going back, like, how did we come to learn the things that we have learned? And the school, it's called the Seattle School for Theology and Psychology, and so it was very progressive, very kind of in some ways even ahead of its time for doing some of the work that has become very en vogue now, where people are um, dismantling their faith and they're trying to rebuild and recreate and make different things. But at any rate, I remember a student was telling a story about their old Sunday school, and they were doing the story of like put on the armor of God. And the kid or the young man who's telling the story said that as a kid, he remembered the sword of, is it righteousness? Is it the sword of
sort of. There's two of us here who have gone to seminary, and I was going to say sort of truth and
the sword of some sort of biblical principle?
of
So yeah,
goodness.
you held the sword. And he always said as a kid, he imagined like never being big enough to hold the sword. And so instead he held a dagger. And everyone in the class laughed. And I remember looking over to Dwight, our professor, Dwight Friesen was his name, and he had tears in his eyes, and his face was bright red. And the not contempt, the anger, the like righteous anger that he held on behalf of this young man's story was, you will never ever make fun of someone's faith, their sort of childish um, upbringing, because we think that we're somehow more evolved or beyond it. And I remember that story so vividly, and I think about it in relationship to this conversation right now, is that we have our own like daggers of whatever, fill in the blank. We can't figure it out, even though we both have masters in. What are those stories for you that you go back and you go, that I needed to distance myself. I needed to go away from home. I needed to sort of say, F you, dad, and go back and go, what are those stories that maybe you have become an unreliable narrator?
Mm,
And there are some moments that are waiting to be unearthed and mined for goodness and kindness that you could still take with you. Now, of course, there are a lot of places that you don't need to revisit, right? There maybe are too harmful and too hard. And I would also say, I'm not sure there is a story that is too hard or too harmful. Now, I'm not advocating for people just to go out there and go dig around just by themselves. I think you need to do that with trained professionals and, with a good spiritual director or therapist. But I know, at least for me, and I'll say it that way, for me, I and in the book, I had tried to do this, go back to some of the darkest stories of my life and have found that there was gold in there. And the longer I ran from them, well, they were always with me anyway. And that's the thing too about stories is our body keeps the score and our body is always holding the stories. And so you may have said F you, Dad, but the stories come with you to wherever you've gone. And so I think that there is a holy work of remembering to be
Yeah.
done.
Well, and one of the things that I found so helpful in both the way you tell, by the way, I think it's helpful for folks to know that like your book isn't a like here's step by step on this. Like it's is it fair
Are
to say
there
it's like
any
a
steps?
memoir? It's a story. Like you're
Yeah.
telling story, and then I'm
Yeah.
grabbing as I'm reading the story that I'm like, oh, I need to like I'm grabbing these things out of it that I'm like I need to lean into that.
Mm,
And so around this, one of the things was uh, you talk about getting really particular in your story
mm,
and moving to the particular. And I was realizing, like, especially in the kinds of Christian circles that you and I have been in, what we tend towards is the generalities of stories and enough to especially as a preacher, enough to appear vulnerable enough for people to feel like what I'm offering them is
mm,
vulnerable,
mm,
but not so much that like I'm actually getting in, like I'm actually parsing out the reality of all of what was there. And
mm.
because like that was the way that I would communicate and that was the circles that I was in, that's where I would even allow, like I could stay there with my story and like what you describe at one point of your book of like you were just telling kind of your story over and over again. It becomes this kind of like, and I resonated with that so much of like I could tell these sort of pieces of it, and I can miss getting into the particulars of it, and I avoid getting into the particulars of it. I don't have a need to, and I'm missing like actually redeeming that story more fully.
Yeah, I think certainly people who find themselves in the role of communicator or pastor or teacher, um, that is I think a constant struggle for the part of the book that you're describing is in a practicum setting. So kind of like a small group, almost group therapy setting. I had retold a 3 act structure of my story over and over again. And at one point, one of the members of my group said that they didn't believe me.
Hmm.
And I was so upset. And I said, "What do you mean? I'm telling a true story." And they're like, "No, no, no. We know that you're telling a true story. But what it seems that you're trying to do is tell your story in a way that it would move us. And we've already been moved and you've done it. Congratulations. You've performed your story impeccably. But what they invited me to was that I might be missing out on myself being moved and changed. That if I would just have the courage to enter into some of those particularities, as you say, that's the word that we use in the book, that maybe I could be changed rather than me being the one to change others, which is really challenging when that seems to be your job. Also, I think it's another thing that I think that people who are communicators wrestle with is they are trying to, if I keep it general, I'm going to kind of get the most amount of people.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
going to attack, I'm going to kind of hit the most buckets of people. And I think that from a storytelling perspective, the opposite is true. When you speak in generalities, you get this sort of milk toast kind of situation. Everyone can kind of feel like, oh, he's just sort of scratching, he or she is just sort of scratching the surface, and there's something more underneath them that they're not sharing. Which, if you are standing up and you're trying to communicate and help people attached to deeper truths of themselves, you actually owe them your story. That I think that there is something to be said is that you can't take someone farther than you've gone yourself. And when it comes to speaking generally, it has the opposite effect in terms of resonating with people. There's a great Carl Sagan quote that I always have misquoted. Uh, the accurate one is the things that are the most specific or the most personal are the most universal. So when you think about any movie that you've seen, that you've been moved by, now that doesn't template your exact experience. In fact, it's gone deep into the life of these characters, and you'll have found resonance in some of those places. And I think that the stories that are told with the most particularity are the ones that have the most resonance. But it's a scary place to go, especially if you feel like if that's your job. And also, I think people have been trained to not do that. We're trained to not tell our secrets. We're trained not to um, reveal who we are, because what would happen then? Would we be met with kindness? Would we be met with me too? Would we be met with, that feeling of being known? And it is a great risk, but I think as I imagine this book now being out, I'm terrified of that, and also I'm really excited.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I experienced that truth in reading your book where like I don't have the same story that you do, but in you telling the particulars of your story, I could find resonance that spoke to me and I could like I don't know, there's something for communicators about trusting people to be smart and to be adults and to be able to
Mm,
so there's something about like you having done your work in a way where the way that you then shared it connected with me in a way where I was then able to move that into like my own experience in life
mm.
and like start making all kinds of like different sorts of connections, right? Where I don't know, I was even thinking as you're talking now in a completely like different lane. I'm doing a class with Richard Rohr right now on
Oh my,
Franciscan spirituality.
what?
Well, it's not actually with Richie, like it's like pre-recorded.
Richie,
It's with
is that what you call him? Does he let you call him that?
well, so it's not actually with him.
So
It's like
he doesn't know you're
it
calling him that.
yeah, it's his organization, the Center for Action and Contemplation.
Yeah,
They're doing
sure.
it and
Okay.
it's stuff they put together of his work. So it's like
I
we
love
watch
it.
his videos and
Amazing.
so one of the things he talks about is Franciscan spirituality moves from the particular to the universal, and that
Yes.
he talks about the idea that in theology we're often trying to move from the universal to the particular, and that's why we create exclusive ideas around God. Is that
Wow.
when you're starting with a universal idea, it's abstract, and you're trying to figure out what fits in that abstraction and what doesn't fit in that abstraction.
Sure.
But if you start with the particular, so he would argue like you can only make sense of God through Jesus. So if you start with the particular of here's the incarnation of the divine being put on display, and that's how then you universalize out of that, it's always going to be a more inclusive move.
Wow.
There's always room, like it's super fascinating to me to think about the idea that particularity invites more in than universality than trying to be universal does.
Yep. 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 1,000%. I couldn't agree more. And I feel like, it makes me think, well, back to being with you and with Rob. So did you want to talk about that? Was that
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
one of
yeah.
your,
Yeah, you're great.
um,
We
so yeah, well, go ahead. What were you gonna say, Mike?
Well, I was just gonna give folks a quick, like
Yeah, go ahead.
a
Yeah.
small group of us gathered with a friend, like our mutual friend Steve Carter and I put together a small gathering where there was, I think, 10 of us with Rob Bell for a day, and then 10 of us hung out after that to kind of like debrief and process. And the original idea was like bring content that you're working on and like sit with Rob, and we're all going to listen in as each person unpacks their content with Rob and he asks questions. And it turned into some of that, some life coaching, some like, yeah.
So yeah, so I brought the book. I was kind of at a kind of tipping point of where the book was going to go and how I should sort of finish it. And so I sat kind of talking about the book, and I remember two things very distinctly. Rob said, when people ask me as I'm working on a book or starting with the idea for a book, they ask me, well, who's it for? He says, well, I have no idea. I don't know it's going to be whoever it's for. And, uh, I love that idea. I also think Rob has heard He's got people. He knows
Yeah.
who he's writing for in a way. And yet the truth remains. It's going to be whoever it's for. And again, like as I mentioned earlier, because I had felt freed up from that sort of circuit, like I need to figure out what my second, third, fourth book is, how I'm going to pitch this to another publisher, how I'm going to get on the speaking circuit, et cetera. All that had been removed. And so that gave me an enormous amount of freedom. And then the next day, as you mentioned, we kind of all reconvened with Rob not being there. And I started asking more questions about the book, and everyone was incredibly helpful. And they were like, "Oh, did you change the title? And you should do this." And all sorts of messing around with what it was. And I left that time together feeling really inspired and really kind of shook, like, "Oh no, like I'm gonna have to change all of this." And then I got back and I kind of settled down, and I write this in the acknowledgement that I took approximately 0 of your feedback. We also coined our group name, and I can't remember how did the name we have been lovingly referred to as the Nugs of Beverly Hills, which is where we were doing this meeting. But do you remember why the Nugs
Yeah, there
came?
was one of the guys named Seth. He kind of went first with Rob, and he talked about an encounter that he had with somebody who was dropping nugs of wisdom,
Oh,
and
Nugs of
then
Wisdom, yes.
nugs became the thing.
Okay, so that stuck out. So in the acknowledgments, if you do buy the book and you go to the very end, even if you just buy the book and just flip to the end, you'll see.
I'll sign the end.
Yeah.
That's where I'll do that for
So
people.
and so there's an acknowledgement to the Nugs of Beverly Hills, and essentially it's me saying to Mike and all the others that were there, I took approximately 0 of your feedback, but you gave me something much greater, and it was the courage to keep going and the courage to finish. And so for that, I'm incredibly grateful.
I love that. I do one of the things I was super intrigued by because of that was having been in that experience with you, where I mean, I feel like it was universally everybody saying like, "Hey, change the main metaphor of the book, change kind of get rid of this like one story that's so meaningful to you that
Yeah,
like isn't
the title of the book, The Cave, the exit, the cave, the whole cave story. They're like, you don't need it.
yeah, yeah, which is based around Plato's cave analogy that he uses.
That's right.
And so like I think universally everybody was like, I don't think that's helpful for you. It's not driving the narrative. I think you're too attached to it. It means too much to you. You need to get rid of it. And then you sent out the book and it's called Exit the Cave. And the cave is such a and so but here's what was super interesting to me was the idea of having something that was so deeply meaningful to you while simultaneously being open to receive criticism and feedback and then sitting with that. And like what you decided to do at the end was kind of like, F you guys, you don't know what you're talking about. There's something deep, like I need to put this thing out. But that those two things would sit in tension together. Cause I think my experience of people is often a movement towards one or the other. That I have this thing that I'm going to do and I don't need to listen to anybody else. Like I know what I need to do. And then there's the like, I'm receiving so much feedback that what's the old like thing that you say that like you were a committee that built a camel?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
That it's like you're getting so much feedback that you're like trying to respond to all of that. And there's something for me that was really beautiful about whatever it was within you that was able to bring those two things together and have a conviction around what you wanted to create that was also open for criticism and feedback.
Is that a question, Mike?
Well, it's like a setup.
Yeah.
It's like
yes. Okay.
Yeah, here's a platter.
No. Yep. I'm being snarky. Which is, I think, something I learned as part of this process. I think first thought is art is always in tension with consumerism, with creativity, with with what you want to say, with who's going to hear it, with commercial. I mean, all of that. So that just feels like a disclaimer. All art feels like it's intention. And for me, I have worked to try and rather than eliminate the tension, embrace it. And then also I think my sort of weird life experience has put me on various, like lots of diverse realms of creativity in lots of different roles. So before I had gone to seminary and ended up working for a mega church, I was an actor and a stage director. I was putting up weird Kafka performance art pieces in alleyways where people were rappelling down from buildings. And I helped to produce and then star in this one-man rock musical about a German transsexual rock star in which I played Hedwig, the name of the role. And then I moved into seminary and then into a very corporate creative setting of a mega church where there's tons of committee and there's tons of feedback and there are tons of just all of that. And the work is every week what you make is being evaluated again and again and again. And sometimes I got to make the thing that I dreamt up and no one touched it and it was amazing. And sometimes the thing that I'd been making in the basement for a year and a half got completely neutered and all of the heart got taken out of it. And then now I'm a commercial filmmaker where it's a lot of the same, a lot of my ideas make it. And some days I'm directing like really fun, edgy, cool stuff with LeBron James. And then this last week I directed a regional grocery store commercial with a dancing chicken mascot in it. Mike? While at the same time, I'm trying to produce a short film that's about the story of my dad and I and our mutual addictions and how this visual poem about what it looks like to live with and be an addict. And so I think what I've learned is to hold all of that intention. So then when it came down to the book, and I think a lot of encouragement from my wife and other people, other friends to go, just when you get quiet, what is it that you want to say? Yeah. When you get quiet and you're not thinking about the audience and you're just thinking about the story that you feel like is right there, that you can't do anything else until you get that out of you and you just do that. And again, I'm in a really lucky position where this book doesn't matter to me. I mean, okay, do I want a New York Times bestseller? Do I want to become the next Donald Miller? Do I want this to be my blue like jazz or, of course I want it to be successful. But when I'm quiet, what I really want is to have been able to say, I told the truth as well as I could do it. And my hope is that in telling my truth, that it might give someone else the freedom to do the same. And I think that's at its core, probably all great art. And that is always intention.
Frick. Blaine, this has been so good.
I've loved this.
A gift. Such a gift.
Thank you.
Genuinely.
Same.
All right, friends. The book is called Exit the Cave, Embracing a Life of Courage, Creativity, and Radical Imagination. It releases November 8th, which that's election day too, right?
Yeah, so, I'm in competition with the midterms, but yeah. I feel pretty confident that most people will be talking about this book on Tuesday, November 8th.
I feel like if you have to choose between like where you're going to give your time and attention to, this is a much more redemptive experience.
100%. Now, I also live in Georgia now. So it's
a big deal.
Yeah, it's a lot going on. So like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Kamala Harris, they're like all coming to my book launch party on November 8th. They've canceled all of their events for the day and they're going to come hang out.
Yeah, and only you could bring those two women together. So I feel like that's really beautiful.
As I said, all art is held in tension, Mike.
So where do people find you on the internets so they can try and, not only pay attention to you, but, get little glimpses of Happy Friday Dance Party?
Sure. Yep. On Instagram, I'm at Blaine Hogan. On TikTok, at Blaine Hogan _ I'll do it again. On TikTok, at Blaine Hogan _ director. And then you can read more about the book at exitthecavebook.com.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks for being here.
Oh my gosh, Mike, thank you.